basically the parts dealing with Falun Gong, saying I didn't say that. They're basically accusing us of fiddling with the transcript and putting words in his mouth. But what they don't say in the interview is that there's a tape where we've got everything in his own voice, interwoven seamlessly, the stuff he admits saying and the stuff he denies saying, nor, of course, any explanation how technologically we could have done that. So that's one strand of evidence and how they dealt with it. Another strand of evidence that I'll mention, because it is something also that they dealt with, is statistics. Now, the government of China doesn't publish death penalty statistics. So what we're dealing with is Amnesty International statistics, and they accumulate statistics basically by going through newspaper reports and tabulating and accumulating all death sentences, which is going to be, I would assume, an underestimate, but it's useful in terms of trends because it indicates whether the death penalty is going up or down, because the methodology is the same from year to year. And so what they show is a pretty steady line for death penalties from year to year, but we can see transplant volumes go way up at the time when the persecution, well, a couple of years after the persecution of Falun Gong begins. Persecution begins in 1999. Transplant volumes start shooting up in 2001. And yet the identified sources remain the same, according to what NGOs have been able to figure out. I should say at all this time, when China is sourcing organs from prisoners sentenced to death, their official line is they're sourcing organs from donors, even though there was no donation system in China. But Human Rights Watch and a few others came to the conclusion there was prisoners sentenced to death. So we see a steady line in prisoners sentenced to death, and it shoots up in terms of transplant volumes. And the transplant volumes come from the health system in China, doctors, health officials, and so on. So we put this in our report, and then the UN starts picking up on this statistical issue. The UN Rapporteur on Torture, the UN Rapporteur on Religious Intolerance, the Committee Against Torture start asking China, explain the discrepancy between the volume of transplants and the volume of sources. And for a while they don't answer that. But eventually their answer is, we don't provide statistics on treatments, only on diseases. So anything that it's in our report about volume of transplants, we've made up. I mean, that's their position. But of course, everything in our report is sourced, and in terms of volume of transplants, it's all official Chinese sources. It comes from hospitals, it comes from doctors, it comes from the health system. And it's all on the internet, and we have links, and we've archived it. And they actually interviewed one of the people we cited, Shi Bingyi, who was a doctor in the health system. He was generating transplant volume statistics, and we cited what he wrote in his articles. So in this Phoenix documentary, they interviewed him, and they said, no, I didn't say that, it's not me, they made it up. And yet, at the time this documentary was being distributed, the stuff that we cited from Shi Bingyi was still on Chinese. I mean, you could still look it up on the original sites, the websites that we'd sourced, so that they were both asserting and denying the same information at the same time. I'll just mention one other kind of response from the government of China to give you an idea of what we're dealing with here. One time, I was in Israel debating this issue, and it was at a hospital, Beilinson Hospital near Tel Aviv, and the Chinese government originally tried to get the foreign ministry to shut down the event or cancel the invitation to me, which didn't work, and I'll say a bit about that later, this phenomenon of trying to shut us up. But anyhow, they eventually sent somebody down to they couldn't shut down the event or get me uninvited, so they sent down somebody from the embassy, the first secretary, to make a speech, and he had a prepared text, and he distributed it, and I kept it. And his position was, our report is based on rumors. Now, if you look at our report and our book, everything is independently verifiable. If you want to check out our sources, you can. You can see what we saw. It's up to you to come to the conclusions we did, but we have no evidence that you cannot see for yourself. And in fact, our work has been peer-reviewed by a few people who've gone through our sources and come to the same conclusion we did. But anyhow, what this guy from the first secretary from the embassy does is he takes a number of statements we have in the report, strips them of citations, puts in front of the statements the phrases, it is said that, or we heard that, or somebody told us that, and then says, look, the report is based on rumor, and basically puts in quotation marks things we didn't say. And I was able to, even if I can't remember everything I said, I was able to, our first two reports are in the internet and they're word searchable, and I was able to check to see that we weren't saying what he put in quotation marks as what we're saying. And so this was the way he established our report is based on rumor. So, what you can see is that what the Chinese government is coming back with is utter nonsense. The Chinese government, they got embassies and consulates around the world. It's a government that represents 1 billion people. They got a multi-billion-dollar budget. And David Kilgore and I are two volunteers. And my attitude is this is the best they can do. And this kind of response leads me to think they really have nothing to say. I myself, because, my view was I'm trying to look of whether this is true or not true, and I have to think about arguments against as well as arguments for. And I myself could find better arguments against my report than the Chinese government could come up with. For instance, with the phone calls, I was thinking, well, okay, I had no doubt those phone calls really happened, and what was on the tapes was really said. But I was thinking, well, okay, maybe even though that was said, it wasn't meant. That these doctors were trying to pump a sale, and they figured that's what the callers wanted, and they figured the callers wanted Falun Gong organs, so the doctors were going to say, yeah, we have Falun Gong organs for sale, because they wanted the money. Okay, but the Chinese government didn't say that. If they'd said that, well, okay, I'd have to deal with it. But no, instead they come up with this business of we fiddled with the transcript, which obviously is not going to convince me. So it just, I'm a courtroom lawyer, and David Kilgore, before he was a parliamentarian, was a prosecutor, and we're both used to dealing with people who disagree with us. But typically, the people who disagree with us in court try to argue plausible arguments. But what we saw with the Chinese government is a preference for the outrageous and implausible over the persuasive and the plausible. And it sort of reminded me of this technique that the Nazis had talked about, the big lie technique, that it's easier to get people to believe a big lie than a little lie, because a big lie is people figure you would not make up a big lie. And I suppose there's something to that, in the sense that people normally, if you take something that is in quotation marks and attribute it to me, most people would think I actually said it. And so that seems to be their response. Anyhow, so David Kilgore and I do this report, we come to this conclusion, and both of us are in addition to researchers and writers, we're also advocates and activists. So we see a human rights violation, we got to see what we can try to do to end it. And we start getting speaking invitations, and we begin this campaign to end the violations, which of course, when I do lots of writing, and when I was introduced as having written 8 books, and in fact it's 9, but I'm writing articles, and all the time I'm doing stuff, and but there was a lot more interest in this than most of the stuff I've written. So I started talking about it and accepting invitations, and there's a lot of pushback from the Chinese government around the world. The Chinese government, aside from having a ridiculous response, basically tries to shut us up and shut us down. Everywhere we go, there's an attempt to get invitations revoked, to get venues canceled, to persuade people not to come. And I can tell you a whole sequence of stories. I mentioned what happened in Israel, where they tried to cancel the event and cancel the invitation. But let me tell you about events that happened in Australia. Because both to me and David Kilgore. David Kilgore came in 2006, immediately after our report came out, and he was speaking in Melbourne to some parliamentarians. There was a committee that had invited him to speak, and the Chinese consulate in Melbourne actually wrote a letter to all the parliamentarians asking them not to go to David Kilgour's talk, and we have the letter, and some people didn't go and some did. I was supposed to be speaking at Bond University a couple of years ago, and at the last minute, Bond University canceled, and this has happened in a number of places where we get last-minute cancellations. Other places we don't, but we're told that the Chinese embassy or consulate has called and asked for cancellation. Normally, we're only told that the Chinese embassy or consulate is called if the request for cancellation is rejected. We're not told if it actually happens. And at Bond University, they basically didn't give any real reason. It was just canceled at the last minute, after they'd accepted it and it had been advertised. So then we moved to another venue, and in Broadbeach, at a community center. And the event takes place in a hall where there's people sitting around like this, and it's also through the internet into China, where people can call in and ask questions. So people are, after my talk, asking questions in the hall, and also through the internet from China. And so this is one of the questions that was asked for me. The guy says he's from the police in China, and it was in Chinese, but I got a transcript of it, and this is what he said in translation. Are you afraid of death? You are brutally interfering in our party's internal policies. Are you afraid of our revenge? Our revenge against you will take revenge against you. Are you not afraid of that? That was his question. So I said, well, the problem is the message, not the messenger. I mean, stop killing Falun Gong for their organs, and the problem will go away. Earlier this year, I was in Melbourne, as I can see, Dr. Elliott was here there too, and when I was in Melbourne, it was a UN panel. It was a UN conference about health, and there was a panel that I'd set up, and there was two doctors and myself and a practitioner on the panel, and then there's somebody in the room who starts taking pictures, ethnic Chinese by appearance, starts taking pictures of the audience while we're talking, one by one, going around the room. And one of the doctors on the panel notices and says, "Who are you? What are you doing? Where are you from?" And the person doesn't say anything, gets up and leaves. That's it. So that was another event. This week, I originally came to Brisbane, and then I went to Auckland, then I came here. In Brisbane, I was speaking at a number of community forums. One of them on Saturday morning was hosted by the Epoch Times at the Taiwan Information Center, and it was a Saturday morning event. And Thursday afternoon, the office of the Epoch Times were shot. A bullet hole goes through the window. They chase out there's people in the office at the time. They go out and they chase after the car, and they get the license numbers. A couple Chinese-looking people in the car, and the police are investigating. Well, and the Epoch Times people attribute the shooting to the fact that they're hosting the event with me that Saturday. And I mean, I don't have a lot of shooting stories, but I have a lot of stories from almost everywhere we went where there's some form of cancellation or intimidation or trying to stop what's going on. Now, at the same time as we're campaigning and the Chinese government is uttering nonsense and trying to shut us down, there's movement on the ground in China and around the world. First of all, the Chinese government shifts from saying it's coming from donors to it's coming from prisoners sentenced to death. Now, the Deputy Minister of Health, Wang Jiefu, had initially said that in 2005, before we did our report, but it wasn't a statement that was pervasive throughout the system. Parts of the system we're still saying in 2005 comes from donors, but now the official line is it's coming from prisoners sentenced to death. And what's more, they say they accept that that's wrong, and eventually they'll get off of it. the market has shifted. The Chinese government now has given a priority to